Welcome, everyone. Here we are for chapter 11 of our Kessler textbook, which is entitled Organizing the Sacred. I always thought this was rather a catchy title for this particular chapter because when we think of the sacred, when we think of spiritual and religious type things, in general, we think more about religious experience and religious stories and the things that religious people do. But the fact is, when you form a new religion, then you must have a manner to organize things. Now, this sounds strange to us, but if you want any kind of group to last, whether it's a church or a synagogue or a brand new religion or, well, a college for that matter, you have to have a way to position organization within the group. Now, what does it mean to organize exactly? All it really means is to create order and stability within the group. There has to be ways that you do things, ways that you decide things. And anytime you get a group of more than 5 people together, if you want the group to last, you're going to have to organize. So that's organization. After organization, however, as the group goes on, you're going to have to institutionalize. And this is another weird kind of word that we use here. Institutionalize here is not necessarily bad, but it means to establish social order on a more permanent basis. So unless this is some sort of ad hoc or temporary group, you need to look to the future and make sure that things can carry on. Maybe after the 7 members you have in the beginning die or move or whatever, there has to be a way for the group to continue to function. Where was I? Excuse me. So, Robert Johnston, who's a sociologist, says there's actually what he calls 5 functional prerequisites of a group. What in the world is that? Well, a prerequisite is something that must exist in order for the group to exist or to continue to exist. And functional means that these prerequisites have to go with how the group is ran or run. I think my grammar is bad there, but I think you know what I mean. At any rate, in order for the group to continue successfully, Robert Johnston says that we need these 5 things. The first one is a manner of recruitment and reproduction. What's that about? Well, it's about bringing new people in. Because even if you start with a large number in your group, eventually people will die, people will move, people will become dissatisfied and move out of the group, people will split off and start their own group because they didn't like the way this group was going. So recruitment and reproduction is essential if you don't want the group to completely die out. You have to find a way to bring new people in. Reproduction to begin with, very simple. People have to come in and have babies, right? That is how many religious groups get their new members, is by the old members having children. But as you know, that doesn't always work. People get older, new babies don't happen very often, if at all. And then you're left with still needing to bring in new people. So that is where the recruitment comes in. You have to have something to pull people in. You have to go and meet the people where they live. You have to have programs that they want. You have to have something that inspires them to join your group. It's very, very simple. A very, very good example of a group that had a hard time with recruitment was a Christian group known as the Shakers. The Shakers definitely did some recruitment, but the Shakers also did not believe in reproduction. they had this idea that people were not to marry or have, or if they did marry, they weren't to have sexual relations, and therefore they could not have children. For a while, they practiced adoption, that is, adopting children who were orphans or in other ways needed a home. But the fact is, I think there are, the last time I checked, which was 5 or 6 years ago, there were only about 5 Shakers left. And so they really did not attend to recruitment or reproduction. And so they're dying out. The second of these 5 functional prerequisites is that of socialization. This is much like when we talked about how myth and ritual help socialize people into a group. In a religious group, socialization entails training and education about the group itself. You learn the group stories, you learn why you do what you do, you learn the stories from the sacred text that help you understand why everybody is doing things the way they're doing. Even in such a disparate group as, the People's Temple by Jim Jones, which many people call a cult, education about the People's Temple's teachings was a daily occurrence. They wanted to know people why they did what they did, why they are who they are. And so that has to be taken care of. If people don't have this sense of belonging, if they do not feel like they are part of the group, and not just legally part of the group, but really a part of the group, they will leave. They will not stick around. So you have to attend to this. The third of the 5 functional prerequisites is that you have to produce a satisfactory level of goods and services. This sounds a little bit strange. What goods and services? It's a religious group. What are they making? Well, nothing exactly. But it's about the fact that you want to have something within your group that makes people want to be there. Whether that is a sense of belonging, knowing that they're going to get great teaching and preaching, whatever it is, you have to do it well. What you offer has to be done in a manner that makes people want to be there. Number 4 of the 5 functional prerequisites is the preservation of order. What does that mean? Well, without this, we end up with chaos. There's maintenance of the organization. You need to keep the group running. Think about this. If you didn't have ways and means, then chaos will take over, and chaos is the enemy of a group. If you've ever belonged to any type of group, there are ways you do things. If you have, an idea that you'd like the group to try out, most groups have some sort of business meeting where you can bring up the idea in the business meeting and the group talks about it. But however you decide on something, there's ways and means to decide on that. Some groups in their business meetings follow Robert's Rules of Order just to keep the business meetings from descending into mass confusion and everybody speaking at once. So if you can't preserve the order, if the bills don't get paid on time, if people don't have a chance to offer up ideas for others to look at, it doesn't work. Things become chaotic, and when things become chaotic, things will fall apart. And number 5 is the preservation of a sense of purpose. What does that mean, the preservation of a sense of purpose? Well, what it refers to is that very often groups start for a reason. Maybe they start because they believe in a particular understanding of God. They think it's very important for all people to know about this particular understanding, and they did want to go forth into the world and spread the word. But what happens if they forget that? What happens if the group just kind of starts sitting around their building and gossiping and eating dinner or showing movies, and they get out of why they came there in the first place? What happens if they lose their sense of purpose? I'll tell you what happens. People leave very quickly. Why do they leave? Because they can go elsewhere for good conversation. They can go to a restaurant for a great meal, and maybe they find people they like in other places to go to the movies with. Without a sense of purpose, a religious group is not going to continue. It will end sooner than we'd like. This is usually reinforced by ideology and practice. When you stick with the things that your group feels are important, when you study those things, when you talk about the important things within the group, the meaning and purpose of life, how shall I put it, how you live your life according to your religious beliefs, all of that goes in to preserving that meaning and purpose. So that's not too bad, really, is it? Now, I told you a few minutes ago about institutionalization and what that meant. Remember? It establishes a social order on a more permanent basis. But there can be some problems with institutionalization. Thomas O'Day, who, excuse me, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought for a minute. Thomas O'Day, who is also a sociologist, was very concerned about and studied quite a bit about institutionalization. He said, because although it's needed, although you have to have that, there are some issues that can come with institutionalization. He called these dilemmas of institutionalization. In other words, while yes, you may need to institutionalize, if you're not careful, your institution can get off the straight and narrow, off the medium path there, and go too far this way or too far that way. And once again, chaos can ensue. So that's not great. Let's look at these dilemmas of institutionalization. And by the way, there's 5 of those too. The first one is the dilemma of mixed motivation. What is mixed motivation? Well, mixed motivation has to do with why we do what we do. Are we doing this for ourselves? Are we doing it for others? A very good example of this is, well, I'll use the example of a church just because it's easier to talk about in that way. A church hires a pastor, and this pastor is a good person with a nice family and is gung-ho. This is what the person is called to do. He's been called to be a pastor, and I'm saying he, it could be a she as far as I know. But he's been called to be a pastor his whole life. He's doing this for the glory of God. Makes sense. Everything starts out great in the church. And then this pastor who came in with one child, he and his wife have, 2 or 3 more children down the road. And he notices that his finances are getting a little tight. It's getting a little rough. So he asked the church, and the church says, you're right, you haven't had a raise since you've been here. You've done a great job. Sure, we'll give you a raise. And so they do. And as time goes by, the church treats the pastor pretty well and continues to give him needed raises. But the church itself, in other ways, is starting to change. A lot of new people are coming in who have some ideas that the pastor is not a fan of. He believes that the pastor believes that the church is going away from their original understanding of the Christian religion, and he's not a fan of it. He doesn't like it. And he can tell that it's probably time for him to move on. The problem is, By this time, he's had 5 kids, and he needs the money. He needs to take care of his children. He needs to take care of his wife. I mean, everybody has a need for a financial situation to be taken care of. So his motivation is not to pastor the church for God anymore. His motivation for staying in that church is financial. This mixed motivation, whether it's with the pastor, whether it's with the congregation itself, for whatever reason they may have a mixed motivation, leads to confusion. And let me use this word again, confusion leads to chaos. And once you get chaos in a group, there are issues. So maintaining the correct motivation on the part of the people is something that a congregation, and I'm using that word loosely, I mean the group that belongs to any religious, the people that belong to any religious group, but your congregation needs to be taken care of and be reminded of why they're there in the first place and what their purpose is. And then there's the idea of what O'Day calls the symbolic dilemma. Religions communicate symbols. They carry with them not only messages, but that the same charismatic and creative elements of the religious message. In other words, if you think about the symbols of any religious group you're in, whether it's in Judaism or Christianity, Buddhism or Hindu or Islam, when you see that symbol, it reminds you of something. It says, this is why we're here to begin with. This is what we need to focus on. And you keep that in you. You remember that. It's brought to the fore all the original reasons you came. But as routinization and formalization of your religious group continue, sometimes there's a danger in forgetting the real meaning, the real point, if you will, of the symbols. Maybe it becomes empty of meaning, or maybe the symbol becomes imbued with kind of a new meaning that involves magic or superstition that wasn't there before. This is usually a sign that the movement, that the religious group is flagging, that it's getting less and less. And some people are trying to revive the group's practices and beliefs, but they're doing it in such a way that forgets the real meaning. When you get into that symbolic dilemma, when you no longer recognize the actual meaning and thought behind the symbol, then your group will be in danger. The third of the 5 dilemmas of institutionalization is that of the administrative order. Look, all groups need some type of administrative order. There has to be a way to get things done within the group. You have to have rules, you have to have ways and means. It's very understandable. But quite frankly, it becomes very easily, especially as the group grows, for bureaucracy to enter this. In fact, you end up with rules for the sake of rules instead of rules for the sake of getting something done. When this happens, the group loses its flexibility. What do I mean by flexibility? Well, I mean where before let's say a group has the idea that at the business meeting, if you have a new idea of something you want to do, bring it up. The group votes on it. And if the group wants it, if there's a simple majority, it continues. But suppose it gets to the point where the group says, no, we're not going to do it quite this way anymore because other people need to weigh in because the pastor and the president of the congregation and this person and that person and the other person, they need to be convinced of it first before it's even brought before the congregation. Now, I'm just making this up. But the fact is you get layer upon layer upon layer of things that need to be done before the big thing can even be voted on. When this bureaucracy happens, people don't want to go through it. It becomes too much, and you lose sight of the message of the group, and you get so involved in the ways and means that you just give up. And once the group gives up, you know what happens. The group will end. The fourth of these dilemmas of institutionalization is kind of a strange word. It's called delimitation, and it's spelled just like it sounds. It's kind of the idea of the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. Usually, with most groups, you have a lot of general guidelines, instructions that, maybe they're intended for specific circumstances, but they become very hard and fast rules. Now, you do need some rules. Don't get me wrong. Of course, every group needs some rules. But sometimes what happens is that the rule becomes the thing, and it takes away from the spirit of what was trying to be accomplished in the first place. The rule, let's say, okay, let me think about it this way. Perhaps the general guideline is that that particular congregation should help out the poor, and they will do so by having a food bank for the surrounding community. That's a pretty good general rule for any religion. And then a rule comes up that says, well, you have to give 5% of your income every week to the food bank outside of the usual amount that you give the church. And if you don't, there'll be repercussions. You won't be allowed to vote in the church business meeting until you catch up. This becomes a little bit difficult. This particular rule is so hidebound, if you will, and so strict that what happens if you lose your job? What happens if somebody in your family gets very, very sick? Then you have to come up with more rules to decide what happens with this. Now, instead of it being a voluntary effort to help people less fortunate, it becomes what shall we call it? It becomes almost tyrannical. You have to give this much, regardless, every time. And if you can't, you need to fill out some forms and get approved not to get this much every time. What happens is that the legalism emerges, and it leaves behind the actual moral command that this started as, and it becomes rules for rules' sake. And then there's the dilemma of power. This is power that is used to manipulate and coerce people. It's usually considered a response to a perceived danger from a membership that may be thought of as declining. The dilemma of power is the idea that once you get people in, you don't let them out. And I don't mean that you simply try everything you can to get them to stay. I mean, you try not to let them out. It comes from this idea that perhaps at first people are coming in joyfully. They're there because they want to be there. They stay because they want the group to grow, and they're all in. But what if they start to disagree with something that one of the leaders does? Suppose they decide this is not where they're supposed to be. What happens then? Well, we would hope that they would be free to leave and find their spiritual needs met elsewhere. With the dilemma of power, however, this idea of power is used to keep people from leaving, perhaps by saying, we're the one and only true church, and if you leave, you're going to hell. Perhaps by saying, when you leave here, you will never be allowed to speak to your friends and family that are still in this group. Anytime that power is used to coerce people into staying, that is the dilemma of power. Well, okay, you get that, right? I mean, it's not a hard thing to understand. Those are the dilemmas. Think about how your church addresses, and I say church once again, I really am talking about any type of religious group. Church is a good shorthand for us today. But think about how your religious group, do they have a problem with any of these dilemmas? What do they do in order to fix them if they do have a power? So, when it comes to organization, one thing that every religious group needs is someone with authority, or maybe several someones with authority. Makes perfect sense. You have to have someone who, well, they don't necessarily need to be a dictator or a king or anything like that, but you have to have somebody that has some sort of authority. And maybe you are part of a top-down religious group. Maybe you're one of the bottom-up religious groups. If you're wondering what that is, very often some churches, the Presbyterians, actually are led by a group called the elders, and then there's the synod, and finally it gets up to the pastor. But the pastor is answers to the elders and the synod. In other religious groups, the top man, whether it's a pastor or an imam or whoever, is in charge and acts much like the Pope in the Catholic tradition. So that's something to think about. But Max Weber, once again another sociologist, said that there were three basic types of religious authority. He said that there was the charismatic authority, there was traditional authority, and there was a legal rational authority. That's three of them. Is that three fingers? I guess it is. With the charismatic authority is not based on rules. It's not based on anything except the person who is in authority, their ability to bring people in and their ability to have people listen to them. I think we've all known people with this type of charisma. They're the ones you just want to be around. And in every group of people, there is somebody like that that just makes you want to come to hear what they have to say. You want to know their opinion. You like the way they are in the world. Charismatic authority is usually revolutionary. It usually involves a break with tradition. Very good example of charismatic authority was Jesus. He wasn't there because he was trained for the priesthood. He didn't really even train to be a rabbi or a teacher at that point. He had authority because people believed what he said. Something about it that was absolutely wonderful. He changed a lot of things, or wanted to change a lot of things, in his particular faith of Judaism. And some people liked it and some people didn't. But the fact is, he was there not because of rules or regulations. He wasn't there because he was the son of somebody important. He was an authority because he had that charisma. And people believed that they saw the truth within that charisma. And that's why he was an authority. Now, usually, while I'm thinking about it, just to give you an example of other charismatic authorities, Moses, Muhammad, and the Buddha, all examples, along with Jesus, of other charismatic authorities. If you think about how they led and how they started, it makes perfect sense. Once a religion is up and running, however, assuming it survives long enough, traditional authority is what is going to supplant the charismatic authority. Why does this happen? Well, usually because uh, religions are started by someone with charismatic authority, but unfortunately, that person at some time in their life will die. Even Jesus, who Christians believe to be resurrected, was taken back up to heaven, so he's not there. And you need somebody on the ground, as it were, to help with this, with leading the group. So, what happens then is that, as a general rule, you end up with someone who has traditional authority. Traditional authority is it's a little more involved than charismatic authority, but it's usually done on the idea of, well, this is the way we do it. Very often, somebody who was very close to the charismatic authority was their maybe a close relative or a very important close follower that helped a lot, was that person's right hand person, will become the authority after the charismatic authority is gone. It's not really based on rules or election or anything like that. It's usually based on the person that the people will listen to, the person who's very close to that charismatic authority can say, well, when so and so was here, this is what he thought. And that brings you into that traditional authority. But eventually, the traditional authority moves on. They die, just like all humans die. And then we start to have this problem is, how do we decide who's going to be our authority now? I assume sometimes another traditional authority can come to the fore, but eventually that will run out. And you have to have someone who ends up having what's called legal rational authority. This is an authority that's based on formalized rules and regulations and standards. Very often people will vote about this person, or they'll sit down and form a committee and say, well, what do we want in our next pastor? And replace imam or rabbi or whatever you want to with the term pastor, and you've got it. Well, we want somebody who can preach well. We want somebody who's interested in evangelizing and somebody who has a heart for social services. And then you start getting people in, right? That is rational, the legal rational authority. It's thought out, and there's ways and means that have been put in place to find this particular authority. Now, believe it or not, some religious leaders have all three types of authority. Desmond Tutu from Africa, South Africa, Dr. Martin Luther King, absolutely. They were they were both charismatic. They had traditional authority, especially when we think about Dr. King within the civil rights movement. He had some traditional authority there because he had been aligned with many other leaders, and so that they knew that he could carry forth. And legal rational authority. Dr. Martin Luther King was a pastor, and the church that he pastored chose him on the basis of their rules and regulations for what they wanted. So it works. Now, another source of authority in any religious group isn't a person. It's scripture, sacred text, so to speak. And very often, sacred texts serve, in fact, almost all the time, sacred texts serve as a source of authority for religious communities. They evolve. Sometimes more sacred texts are added. Sometimes, seldom, but sometimes some sacred texts are said not to be sacred. and they're found not to be applicable anymore, and they are removed. Sometimes you get new interpretations of sacred text and new interpretations of what should or shouldn't count as scripture. But a sacred text or scripture establishes a worldview. It gives you a way to understand life. Scripture is indeed a social event, as it were, and the message is carried through any given religion's scriptures, and it is this message that is seen to be seen to be as it. I'm saying this completely messed up here. The message within the scripture is what the religion usually would want to be at the center of claims of power. In other words, when the authority says, I have the power, they want to know that they can relate that person's power back to what the scripture says the person in power or authority should have. Well, that is chapter 11. Our next video will be chapter 12, which is the last one we're going to have this semester. As you know, the last unit covers chapters 10, 11, and 12. Now, this is not because I dislike chapter 13. I think it's very interesting, and I encourage you to read it for your own sake. But there's a limit to how much we can do in one semester. So as you're getting ready in this last semester, please read the chapters. It helps so much. I can't cover everything in the chapter in a video. You need to read the chapters. I can't think of anything else to tell you. Chapter 12 may be up today. It may be tomorrow, depending on how things go at my house. But it will be up shortly. So keep studying and enjoy it. And as you study, think about what you're reading. Think how it relates to your own life and your own religion. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.